Greetings, everyone, friends, and welcome to The Seed, today's presentation on that very subject. I am James Stevenson, coming to you today from Brooker Creek Preserve in northern Pinellas County in Florida. I am an education and outreach botanist. I have the great fortune to spend my days studying plants on behalf of the citizens of our county, Pinellas County, through the vehicle of the University of Florida Institute of Food and Agricultural Sciences. Today's presentation will be about the very subject, the seed. And if you have joined us, if you signed up for this class, you have demonstrated some sort of an interest in learning more about this particular thing, the seed, and what it is, how it affects us, how it works, where it comes from, where it goes. We're going to try and answer those questions today and more. Feel free to use the chat function or the Q&A function to send any messages, questions, comments, complaints, anything you want us to go over again or address that we don't quite get to. Do feel free to use that Q&A and the chat. And there will be one poll at the end of today's presentation so that we can get your feedback and store it away at a nice place where we can always refer. We're always endeavoring to make our presentations better and better. So let's jump into the seed. I'm going to get technical early. I'll throw all the big words out at the beginning, and then we'll spend time taking them apart, explaining them. So to a botanist, to whom the seed is ultimately a major import, the seed is the sexual reproductive unit of a group of plants that are known as the conifers, the gymnosperms. We call them conifers, but there's a few more that don't really make cones. Anyway, sexual reproductive unit of this group called the gymnosperms and the flowering plants, the angiosperms. And that unit contains the embryo of the plant from which it came. So the offspring of the mother plant and the father plant, if you will. The seed also contains a little bit of food, literal food, literal sustenance for that embryo to start it on its journey towards being the next generation to produce seeds. Okay, it's pretty straightforward. In big words, we're going to parse that out and see where all that comes from. Now, if you've joined us before, you have very likely seen this slide. It's a subject that I like to kind of carry on about over and over again, where when dealing with the plant kingdom, there are four very easily understood major groups of plants that are exclusive of one another. Two of those big four groups that we call them reproduce by spores. Those are the mosses and the ferns. The other two, which we're concerning ourselves with today, are the seed plants, the gymnosperms, the naked seeds, which is how that literally translates, and the angiosperms, the protected seeds. So those are the seed plants. These are the ones that produce those familiar things that we discuss, that we're aware of, that we've heard of, perhaps we've planted, perhaps we've eaten. Of course, seeds are extremely important to us as human beings, and we tend to care more about things that have an economic import to us or a nutritional import to us. So let's understand some of these things. The next time you're chewing on an almond, think about what you're consuming there. Of course, the seeds of a particular family of flowering plants, an entire related group of flowering plants that are known as the legumes. they produce seeds that are of utmost economic importance. Just think how many places you can find soy products. Soy is a plant that belongs in the legume group of flowering plants, along with peanuts, lentils, chickpeas, black-eyed peas, so on and so on. Incredibly economically important group for their seeds. Other seeds have other economic and social importance. The castor bean, a very formerly very highly sought after source for its oils. Perhaps you've heard of castor oil coming from the seed of the castor bean plant. It's not an actual legume, but it has a seed that harkens the shape of a legume seed, and so it gets this common name, castor bean. It's actually more closely related to, in fact, very closely related to, the poinsettia plant that you might have in your home in the holidays. And something you may know about that plant is that it contains toxins, as does the castor bean and the castor plant itself. So some seeds have economic importance and social importance in that certain untoward activities, including extracts from the castor bean, have been attempted against other humans' lives. So seeds have huge importance. So with that in mind, having gone over all that gobbledygook, what we'll do today is we'll break down this subject into the following: anatomy of the seed, the formation of the seed, and then how the seeds get away from their parent plant, because that's of utmost importance in the reproduction of any individual organism, is to get offspring away. Very many, very good reasons for getting offspring away. So you don't compete for resources, to mix up the gene pool, and so on. So seed dispersal is a pretty important topic. What happens once the seed is dispersed? How does a seed break that dormancy and become the next tree? And we'll end up with how seeds are saved, because seeds are also very often little time capsules that can wait extremely long periods of time until the conditions are just right for them to grow into that next generation. And there are some extreme examples of that. So we'll look at seed banking to finish up. But we'll start with the anatomy of the seed. What is a seed? Now, be it from a flowering plant or from a conifer, they're made of the same parts. Let's take a look at some of those parts. Well, in the case of the flowering plants, the angiosperms, the protected seeds, the seeds are literally protected within a structure that's called a fruit. Whether you like it or not, that's what it's called. Botanically speaking, what the seed is contained in is botanically referred to as the fruit. Here, the peanut is representing our fruit. So inside the flowering plant's fruit, we find the seeds. So now we have the same parts. The seed coat, which can be a very thin film that protects the developing embryo and its associated food, called the cotyledon. Kind of a funny word. I didn't break it down for you etymologically, but the cotyledon lends terminology to the two main groups of flowering plants. I don't know if you remember this, the monocots and the dicots. I don't know if you've ever heard those words before, the monocots and the eudicots. That refers to the seed leaf, the cotyledon. Now, it's not a photosynthetic organ. It sits in the dark, protected with the embryo. slowly feeding that embryo until it gets big enough to make its own food. So that's the role of the cotyledon, to support the developing embryo. And of course, the embryo is the baby plant, the offspring of the plant which bore the fruit, bore the seed with the embryo inside. Gymnosperms, similar, except for the fact that being non-flowering plants, gymnosperms, excuse me, of course, do not produce a fruit. Their seeds are naked. They do have a seed coat, and sometimes that seed coat, but not fruit. The seed coat can be quite robust. And oftentimes with the conifers, at least, a bit of the scale of the cone that bears the seed remains attached to the seed to help it get away from home once it's mature. So how do seeds develop? We'll look at a flowering plant. Most of the plants that you see at your window are actually flowering plants. So we'll take a look at that representative group the most. And flowering plants, of which everything out there mostly is, flowers have ovaries. Ever heard that word before? And ovaries, be they mammalian or of the flowering plants, they produce eggs. In botany, we refer to the eggs as ovules, maybe not an unfamiliar word. So in flowering plant, we have these ovules that are contained within an ovary. We know that the bees bring pollen unwittingly, but they do, and they deposit it on one part of the flower, which ultimately is connected to this ovary with the ovules inside. That pollen, once deposited on the flower, physically germinates. A pollen grain will physically germinate and grow towards the ovary, towards the ovules, and then fuse with an individual ovule, an egg cell. And a pollen grain actually has a little sperm cell in it that then exits and unites with the egg cell to form an embryo. Of course, the embryo is part of the seed. And so the seed is developed from that egg cell, protected in flowering plants by the tissues of the ovary. Now, in the gymnosperms and the conifers, it's a little less complicated. The conifers represent a less specialized group of plants that developed on Earth before the flowering plants. So things are a little bit simpler with them. When the conifers developed, there were no insects, there were no bees bringing pollen. Everything was done by the wind because that was free and available. There were no insects. So what was at hand was the wind. And the wind would bring pollen from one tree to the other, and the pollen would land on the scales of a female cone. On those scales, completely exposed to the world, completely naked, gymnosperm, remember, are the ovules. They're not protected in a nice little ovary. They're just sitting out there on those scales, receiving pollen from the wind. Same process happens. The pollen grain germinates, and a sperm cell works its way through that pollen tube and finds the egg, unites with the egg to form the embryo. And that takes an awful long time for most of the conifers. The development of the female cone can take 2 or 3 years. And sometimes that sperm doesn't even unite with the egg cell until the seeds themselves are being shed from the tree, kind of really waiting until the last minute. But this is the case with most of the gymnosperms. Naked seeds, naked eggs, first of all, sitting bare on the scales of the female cone, with the wind bringing the pollen for fertilization. In both cases, the embryo is formed. And again, I'm sure you've heard the word embryo and embryonic as a very early developmental stage of an organism. The embryo sits there ready to grow, equipped by its mother with this lunchbox, I like to call it, this little to-go bag of the cotyledon. Very starchy, very oily, obvious why we have taken many seeds into our nutritional input, because they are very nutrient dense on purpose. The nutrients are intended for this embryonic plant as they wait to germinate. We and many other animals can then take advantage of all that concentrated nutrition in the form of starches, oils, sugars, all the things that plants are really good at making, synthesizing, and sequestering into these nutritive seed leaves. The embryo itself actually is made of some parts. The upward facing part, the young leaves in an embryo, in a seed, referred to as the plumule, the little feather. The nascent root is referred to as the radicle. Maybe you've heard that root in the word radish, the root of root, radical, radish, the primordial root. If you tuned in early, you may have seen a time lapse of a seed germinating. You would have seen that radical pushing downwards with gravity and becoming the first established root of that plant as it grows. And again, the nutritive cotyledon that's going to feed all this as it's going to allow all these things to happen. Once the seed is formed and is ripe, it has to wait. Using the nutrition of the cotyledon until such time as the seed is allowed to leave the parent plant, the mother plant. Because the next step, of course, is getting out of the house and going on your merry way and sowing your own wild oats. So seed dispersal will be next. And how do plants get their seeds away? Remember, the gymnosperms were around before insects. There was no insect facilitation of pollination. They used the wind. The wind was free and available. These plants had managed, many of them, to get very, very tall. So they had access to great height, great gusts of wind that could carry their seeds quite a distance from the parent plant. And so many, many conifers today have not adapted. They haven't needed to. The wind has been a perfect facilitator for both pollination and for dispersal. So the wind is a very effective and free dispersal mechanism. Flowering plants have also taken advantage of wind dispersal and wind pollination, I could add. Not all flowering plants are pollinated by insects. That's a different lecture for a different day. But the wind can certainly disperse flowering plant seeds. Now, in the case of the dandelion, which might be the classic wind dispersed, it's important, or I like to think it's important, to nuance what's happening here just a little bit better. Yes, the dandelion does use the wind for dispersal of its seeds, but the seeds of the dandelion are still protected. Each one of these little parachutes is a single flying ovary with a single seed inside. So the entire fruit of this plant is represented by one little parachute or umbrella, if you will, that's going to sail with the seed intact inside, far away from the parent plant. Other flying seeds and truly flying seeds are represented by the milkweed. If you've ever grown or if you're familiar with milkweed, the seed in the photo behind me here, the ovary, in this case, stays attached to the plant. This is a flowering plant, the milkweed, so it has an ovary. In this case, the ovary stays attached to the plant, and the ovary dries and splits open and releases seeds from inside the ovary, each one of which equipped with a little plume of fibers that allow the seed itself to sail far away from the parent plant. So these are dried, split ovaries when they're ripe. When the seeds are ready, everything's getting ready to go, they can send their seeds flying. And no matter, despite the fact that these seeds in the milkweed are very thin and papery themselves, very lightweight, helping with that wind travel, despite the fact of their very thin size, they still are equipped with nutritive cotyledons, enough to feed the developing embryo inside until such time as germination. So the milkweed seed, despite its seemingly skinny nature, has everything that it needs to complete its journey to germination upon landing in a suitable spot. Maple trees, they have actually recently finished shedding their seeds. Their seeds are contained within a dried ovary that's winged. So each one of this pair of wings, each one is a ripened ovary, and inside of that ovary is a seed. So my point with these examples is to point out that we may have an idea of what a seed is, being a small little dried plant propagule, but oftentimes it's actually a dried piece of fruit, right? Or the fruit itself could be the dried up part and the seed is actually still inside, like the case with the dandelion, or in this instance, the maple seed, the little helicopter, the little propeller that we find on the sidewalk. It's not the seed. The seed is inside that propeller. The propeller is the ripened ovary. Now, the ripened ovary with the seed or the seeds inside is technically called a what? I've said it a couple of times. I've given away the answer, but I'm hoping we're paying attention. A ripened ovary of flowering plant. Remember, only flowering plants have ovaries. The ripened ovary containing the seeds, which are developed from the eggs from within that ovary, is technically called a fruit. Now we have done a whole hour on fruit and the whole concept of fruit and everything like that. But from going up, thank you, Carrie, for chiming in. Yeah, going forward, we understand that that ripened ovary is the fruit, and fruit only belong to the flowering plants. The conifers, they don't make fruit. They make cones, and their seeds are developed from eggs that sit naked on those cone scales. We know a lot of fruit with seeds inside. We know a lot. Again, we've done an hour on kitchen botany where we explore how much we already know about plants just by handling them every day and eating them every day and dealing with all their parts. So we know a lot of fruit. And fruit, of course, is a word that belongs to botany and nutrition, although we don't use the word in the same way all the time. In botany, it's the ripened ovary, and we have plenty of examples of those fruits. One of the roles of the fruit is to somehow facilitate not only the protection of those seeds, but more importantly, for the success of the species, the fruit helps facilitate the dispersal. So in the conifers, we just have wind and wings, and that's it, we're done. The flowering plants, being the show-offs that they are, have to one-up everything. And some absolutely fantastic mechanisms are embedded in various fruits to facilitate getting the seed inside very far away from home. There's a fruit called a coconut. And inside that single seeded fruit, did I say inside that single seeded fruit? Inside that fruit is a single seed. The dispersal mechanism for the coconut is water, seawater. And lots of hormonal triggers and temperature and salinity, all kind of things conspire to prevent that seed from germinating until the coconut has come to rest. That liquid endosperm stops sloshing around when it comes to rest, signaling that it's come to dry land. The heat of the beach heats up that liquid endosperm that we call coconut water. That triggers germination as well. The presence of fresh water or a greater concentration of fresh to salt water triggers that germination as well. But ultimately, the fruit is facilitating the dispersal of the seed far away from the parent plant on the water. And it is excellently set up to do that. Animals, which of course came along way after the conifers, the flowering plants kind of coincided with the rise of animals on Earth. And so not only did flowering plants have access to insect animals for their pollination, eventually they had access to larger animals that the plants could take advantage of to get their children far away from home. The sand spur, each sand spur is a ripened ovary with a single seed inside. This particular ovary is, again, a dried ovary, and it's covered in sharp spines. It's a single seeded fruit called a grain. Yes, sand spur is a grain, a word that, again, the botanists and the nutritionists have shared, but not always applied in the same way. And we all know that sand spurs are quite effective of using animals to disperse the fruit with that single seed inside. So too are the fruit of bidens. Now, again, you have a dog, you've taken them for a walk anywhere in Pinellas County, you have groomed your pet of these fruit. You might call them seeds because they're small and dry, but technically these are single-seeded fruits, special kind of fruit called an achene. But look at the barbs on the tips of the Spanish needles, those three little, that trident with the backward-facing barbs. It's definitely built to hitchhike on a passing animal and use that animal for the dispersal of the seed inside. Another hitchhiker that uses animals, uses the exterior of animals. The ovaries of this legume, they form a very brittle, dry legume covered in Velcro. Actually, literally, the inspiration for Velcro comes from a plant not unlike the beggar's ticks, another one that you're either constantly pulling off your socks, out of your washing machine, or off your pet, right? These very effective mechanisms for dispersing the seed that is inside this modified ovary. When it's time for the animal to groom, that is usually far away from the plant that it was visiting. Animals generally go to some place different for their grooming activities. And if in the case of a more natural setting, if this bird were to take a bath in a natural pond or puddle, those fruit with the seeds inside, of course, would be shed in an area that had lots of nice water right at hand. So, plants obviously knowing what they're doing. This gets us to the subject of animals and animal dispersal. Many plants will produce seeds and fruit in huge quantities, just huge quantities. Think of the sand spurs, think of wheat fields. In this case, this is the sunflower. Each one of these little striped structures are individual fruits. They are each developed from a single flower, crowded into the center of a sunflower. The sunflower is actually a multiple of hundreds of tiny flowers. This hard shelled fruit called an achene has a single seed inside, and they are produced in enormous quantities because there is also almost a knowing by the plant that quite a few of these are going to be consumed by animals, going to be consumed, never going to germinate because they're going to be chewed up and eaten. Seeds, the fruit's going to get cracked open, the seed's going to be eaten, the calories are going to go into a different organism. But this great quantity, the economy of scale, should allow for at least one seed to fall that will survive, one fruit to fall with a seed inside that can survive to adulthood and reproduce that particular organism. So there are birds that are actually built to deal with hard fruits. The beak of the northern cardinal is built to crack through the hard shell of many dried fruits to access the nutritive seed inside. Another mechanism for animal dispersal, of course, is the portable digestive system. Many animals eat, consume, swallow seeds, but the seeds remain intact. Rather than the destructive force of the cardinal eating, consuming, swallowing, digesting, grinding up the seed that's never going to germinate, but produced in quantity that hopefully one will be overlooked. Many fleshy fruits, juicy fruits that aren't dry and hard with an external shell. Fleshy fruits contain seeds that are small enough and yet strong enough to survive a trip through the digestive system of something that has consumed that fruit. I'm sure that makes sense. A point we might not need to belabor. Now, what is big enough to pass this through its digestive system? The avocado is quite an interesting story. The avocado is native to Central and South America. It's a huge seed. This is very close to the wild plant that avocados were domesticated from. Unlike many of our other culinary, nutritive plants, we haven't really exaggerated the avocado that much. So this is a plant that looks very much like its wild ancestors. And so this is a plant that has a dispersal mechanism for its seed that matches the size. What on earth could swallow an avocado whole and pass the seed through its digestive system? Well, it doesn't exist anymore. The avocado evolved alongside megafauna that doesn't exist, it is extinct. And the only reason that the avocado is still around is because humans have taken it into cultivation. The avocado could not survive on its own in the wild. Its dispersal mechanism that it co-evolved with, providing food in exchange for passing of seeds, are extinct. So thanks, humans. Most fleshy fruits, however, that are still around today have some sort of mechanism to protect the seed that is inside that fruit. And these plants will place the fruit and thus their seeds into organisms that are going to best get their seeds as far from home as possible. Birds are fantastic at this. Think of the distances that birds can travel. And birds don't need to eat much. So a plant can invest in a lot of small, nutrient-dense fruit with a single or just a few seeds inside, and the birds can visit the plant, strip the plant, get the nutrition they need, and grab the cleaned seeds a great distance from where they originated, from the parent plant. So I mentioned before, these seeds that are within these fruits that are designed to be consumed, they have to survive that trip through the digestive system. Some seeds are dependent on being digested or being sent through a digestive system. They won't germinate until they have been on that journey, because they are going to be cleaned of the flesh that surrounded them, and they are going to be a great distance from their parent plant. So some seeds are actually triggered to germinate by being digested. It's pretty cool stuff. The queen palm, if you are unfortunate enough to have one of these in your sphere of influence, the queen palm, it's probably the most popular non-native plant that has been installed throughout our county, the queen palm. It produces a fleshy fruit with a single seed inside. Being a palm, like our coconut, it produces a fruit with a single seed inside. And in the case of the queen palm, it's not a floaty fruit, it's a fleshy fruit. And the queen palm fruit, out of its native range and in our range, is a favored food of the coyote. So the coyote can will smell out piles of queen palm fruit that nothing else seems to want to eat. The coyote will gobble those up. The coyote is another very effective transportation mechanism, dispersal mechanism for the queen palm. And coyote will take themselves and their bellies back to their den, and before going to bed for the night, they'll leave a little deposit outside the den. And we are finding queen palms further and further and further into our fewer and fewer remaining natural areas. So this is how the queen palm is invading our natural areas. It's hitchhiking in the coyote's belly. Now the seeds themselves do not want to be chewed up, ground up, and have their cotyledonal nutrition stolen from the embryo. So all of those little sunflower fruits, that's one case where there's an economy of scale where millions are produced with the hopes that one will survive. That's one strategy. Another strategy for seeds to prevent being eaten is to concentrate toxins or other unpalatable compounds in the seed to make the seeds disgusting. So the fruit might be nice that the seeds are in, but if you bite down on one of the seeds, you'll never do that again. You'll just go ahead and swallow that seed and let it pass. The seeds themselves oftentimes contain noxious compounds. And humans being humans, we can't get enough of them. We love them. We love those noxious compounds. We call them spices. A lot of our spices are seeds, of course. There's another mechanical dispersal mechanism. There is another dispersal mechanism that is mechanical, that is employed by very different groups of plants. Happen to find this one of the exploding cucumber. This is a literal mechanical distribution of seeds away from the parent plant. I have grown this plant. It's true. Pressure builds up within this cucumber, along with quite a lot of water and water pressure. And when the temperature is just right and something brushes up against this, the little cucumber will actually race across the garden in a stream of seeds, which of course will then go and develop. Other plants that have mechanical seed distribution mechanisms. If you've ever been to the mountains of North Carolina, there's a plant called jewelweed or impatiens or touch me not. It has an explosive fruit. It literally flings seeds far from the parent plant. These things are quite fun to play with. So once the seeds are far away from the parent plant and cleaned off of their husks, their fruit, if the fruit has been removed, the seeds have been removed from the fruit, and now they have found themselves in a suitable environment, they germinate. And that's pretty straightforward. There are many triggers for germination. But of course, a seed being a time capsule and having those nutritive cotyledons can wait until the conditions are just perfect for the success of that plant in that place. Usually, the triggers are a threshold temperature combined with an amount of water. So a seed might fall, a fruit might be removed from a plant and transported in the autumn. And then the seed will sit cleaned of all the debris that surrounds it, either the fruit or the shell that it was contained in or anything, whatever it takes. The removal of that, combined with a rising temperature and an increase of availability of water, along with some hormones, sometimes light and light intensity, light duration, can impact the stimulation of the seed to imbibe water. And that imbibition, which is a hilarious word, causes everything to start to expand and grow. And it allows that little radical to push down and the little plumule to push up, and the initial seeds, the initial leaves, the true leaves, not the cotyledon food, but the true leaves, can begin to photosynthesize and feed the rest of the plant, and off you go. So here we have that seed germination, and it's in one group of plants, there are 2 cotyledons, and in another group of plants like corn, here we have corn belongs to a group of plants that only has the 1 cotyledon, but it's the same idea. The radical goes down, the cotyledon goes up, and eventually the first true leaves appear. It's true as well in the conifers. The radical goes down, the plumule goes up, and we have ourselves a baby plant, and the seed has done its job. Some pretty funny seeds, maybe, I've seen. The coco de mer is the largest seed. This, of course, is the fruit of this palm. Inside this hard-shelled fruit is the largest seed of this particular palm. The smallest seeds belong to a group of flowering plants that you're probably familiar with, the orchids. And those little flecks in your vanilla ice cream are fully formed, fully functional orchid seeds. They are, the seeds of the orchids are like dust. So the orchids are flowering plants. Flowering plants have ovaries. Ovaries develop into fruit. The kidney bean is a fruit. The dust-like seeds of orchids are so reduced that they require associating with fungus in order to get the surface area that they need as seeds to start to imbibe water. They depend on an association. It's nuts, but obviously it's very effective because there's plenty of orchid species. Largest seed, coco de mer. Smallest seed belong to this group of flowering plants called the orchids. They can have seeds that are only a few cells. So let's finish up with seed banking. You may have heard of seed banking, the importance of saving seeds, putting seeds away, taking advantage of the seed's ability to be a time capsule. Many people who are gardeners will save seed from one year to the next. There are better ways than others to do this as a human. If you want to intervene, it's important to prolong, take advantage of the individual plant's dormancy. That's how we get dormouse, because they go dormant for quite a lot of the year. They're dormant mice. Anyway, a seed's dormancy needs to be addressed, and to safely and effectively store seeds, you need to meet some certain requirements. Now, for you and me, the easiest way to provide a prolonged dormancy for any seed, for most seeds, is to keep those seeds airtight, so not exposed, in the dark, away from any source of humidity, and at a very low temperature. And for us, Nothing does that better than an old film canister, which are getting harder and harder to find, an old film canister. So we keep the light out, keep the air out, keep the humidity and the temperature down by putting that in a refrigerator. Just a simple domestic refrigerator. And these little film canisters, they don't take up very much space. Just be sure that the seeds are put away cleaned. Again, dormancy can depend on the absence of any of the tissues that might have surrounded the seed prior to its being removed from the fruit. So a nice clean seed going into storage and then kept in the dark, low humidity and a low temperature. Very, very simple. As I mentioned before, many of our spices that we use, we take advantage of the noxious chemicals that plants try and bestow upon their seeds to keep them from being eaten. We love to grind them up and eat them. We can prolong our seeds that we intend to eat in the same way by providing the same conditions. So you'll want to store your spice seeds in the dark, away from heat and humidity, and at a low temperature. On a conservation scale of seed banking, there are many seed banks in the world. The one that I'm most familiar with was built using what was at the time called the Millennium Fund. And it was built and is operated by Kew Gardens, the Royal Botanic Gardens in Kew. And the idea of the Millennium Seed Bank is to store wild seeds, especially those that come from places that are in danger of disappearing, like islands or rainforests or scrub. The Florida scrub that runs down the spine of our state is the most endangered landscape type in the world. So the plants of the Florida scrub, the seeds are collected and banked in a place like the Millennium Seed Bank. And also plants that are prioritized for banking here would be ancestors, wild ancestors of food plants. So everything that we have turned wild mustard into, here at the Millennium Seed Bank, they would bank the wild mustard itself so that in the future, cultivars could be recreated again. You may have heard of the Norwegian Seed Bank. This one gets a lot more press because it's a lot sexier. It's in a mountain and it's in the frozen tundra, deep underground, and, you know, blasting with TNT. And it's even called the Doomsday Vault, just to get the public's attention. This is the Doomsday Vault seed bank in Norway. This seed bank is concentrated most on cultivated plant seeds, crops, all the different varieties of corn, all the different varieties of wheat. So they're not species, they're frankenplants that have been created by people. This is where their genomes are banked in the little seed time capsules, taking advantage of their prolonged dormancy. So let's sum up some fun seed facts. The seed is only produced by two groups of plants. Of the big four that we all know, mosses, ferns, conifers, and flowering plants, seeds are only produced by conifers and by flowering plants. In conifers, they're naked. In flowering plants, they're encased in a fruit. Conifers have these naked seeds. Conifers depend on the wind. The wind is free. The wind is eternal. The wind was around when the conifers first came around. And of course, the flowering plants have protected seeds. They're protected in this organ called an ovary. And sometimes that ovary is fleshy when it's ripe. Sometimes the ovary is dry and crackly and spiny when it's ripe. But either way, the seed is protected in that ovarian tissue. Conifers and some flowering plants using the wind for dispersal. The flowering plants, of course, have this developed ovary that's going to have some mechanism to aid in the dispersal, whether it be a dry and floaty ovary, ripened ovary with a single seed inside each one of those parachutes, or a clingy, dried ovary that's going to attach itself to the exterior of a passing animal, be it a bird or a mammal, a pet, or a sock. Fruit can be fleshy and yummy with a very robust seed inside that fruit that can survive being masticated a little bit, swallowed and passed through a digestive system. And when everything is just right, when that seed is far from the parent plant and it lands in a place that has the right temperature and the right water, germination occurs. And the next generation of that plant can issue forth. Each seed comes equipped with a little to-go bag of nutrient-dense cotyledon tissue that was bestowed upon the embryo in the seed as its little, its little knapsack. Go away from here with your knapsack until you can make your own living. And we know perhaps that seeds can lie dormant for years until the conditions are just right for germination. And there are legendary seeds that have been taken from tombs, thousands of years old, and have been germinated. There have been seeds found in permafrost, which is, just like it says, a ground that is permanently frozen, containing seeds of plants that existed prior to that land becoming frozen in the thousands of years, and those seeds germinating upon proper thawing out. We can take advantage of those dormancy triggers to save our own seeds if we address what they need. They need to be cool and dry and dark. You can preserve your own seeds, even if they're just your spices, by keeping them someplace cool and dry, no humidity and no light. Unfortunately, where do most people have their spice rack? Over the stove where the pots are boiling and it's bright kitchen lights and it's hot and humid? Unfortunately, yes. Get you one of those little clear shoe boxes, put your spices in there, put them in the refrigerator and close the door. You're going to prolong the life of your spices that way. Seed banking for reals is an integral part of conservation of endangered species. And that's done by the professionals in -4 degree Fahrenheit underground seed banks that are curated. Seeds are tested for germination after a certain time. But seed banking is a very, very important conservation tool for all of us. That gets us right up to 3 o'clock. I appreciate your time. I want to give you the opportunity to clack out any questions in the chat or in the Q&A. And after just a couple of minutes of that, I'm going to launch a poll, and we would love to get your feedback about today or any of the other webinar lectures that you may have attended to. I'll just see if we have any questions. We have one from Carrie. How many pounds is the Coco de Mer seed? That's a great question. I can't remember. It's close to 7 or 8 pounds. And the idea of that heft is it can crash through a very significant understory of stacked up palm leaves. And it can also survive extremely long journeys on the sea. The Seychelles are where that tree is native to. So thank you for that question. If you wouldn't mind just clacking in your whole answers, we'll go ahead and leave that up for a few seconds more, and then we'll take that down. But we really appreciate you joining us today. We hope that you'll tune in again next month. And if you do have the time, find our recorded webinars on our YouTube channel. Just look for Pinellas Extension on YouTube, the YT, and you can find many of our recorded programs and lectures on a variety of subjects. So thank you again for joining us today, and we will see you next time.